Well, the UN said today that according to satellite imagery, around 1/5 of the infrastructure in Gaza has been destroyed since the outbreak of the war with Israel. Well, the UN's World Food Programme says that half of Gaza's 2.3 million strong population is starving, this with food, fuel and medicine supplies cut off from the enclave. Well, the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry says that Israel's assault, which was in retaliation for the 7th of October Hamas attacks, has resulted in at least 18,200 Palestinians being killed. Well, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke today about his vision for how Gaza will be run once the war is over.
Yes, there is disagreement about the day after Hamas, and I hope that we will reach agreement here as well. I would like to clarify my position. I will not allow Israel to repeat the mistake of Oslo. After the great sacrifice of our civilians and our soldiers, I will not allow the entry into Gaza of those who educate for terrorism, support terrorism and finance terrorism. Gaza will be neither Hamas-stan nor Fatah-stan.
The Israeli Prime Minister speaking there. Meanwhile, the US President Joe Biden today expressed further concern at Israel's bombardment of Gaza. He suggested that the Israelis are starting to lose international support, and he said that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu needs to change his hardline government. Well, in this context, President Biden specifically mentioned Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is Israel's far-right national security minister. The UN General Assembly looks like it's on track to back an immediate demand for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza, where the war between Israel and Hamas is now in its third month. Well, the resolution mirrors the language used in last week's resolution, which was blocked by the US at the UN Security Council. Well, a two-thirds majority is needed, and although General Assembly resolutions aren't binding, they do carry political weight. Well, the EU's top diplomat, Josep Borrell, has been speaking as well about the humanitarian losses in Gaza. Well, let's speak now to Rosa Freedman, who's a professor of law, conflict and global development at the University of Reading in the UK. Thank you so much for joining us. There's lots of things we could talk about, but let's start with that vote at the UN. Does it matter?
Well, it matters politically. It will show what the UN General Assembly, the 193 members of the United Nations, think about the resolution that's been tabled. We know that Austria has tabled an amendment to say that there needs to be condemnation of Hamas within this resolution. America has also tabled an amendment to it. But if you're thinking about what matters in terms of UN action, we know that the only UN body that can take enforcement action, embargoes, no-fly zones, sanctions, authorized use of force, is the Security Council, and the General Assembly cannot compel the Security Council to act.
Okay, and I mean, do you think? Well, first of all, let's talk about the weight that you say this vote carries. I mean, do you think we are seeing something of a shift in attitudes, and the international support for Israel is starting to wane somewhat?
It's very difficult to be able to tell that from the UN General Assembly, where each state carries one vote. So the Marshall Islands has the same vote as China, despite the great disparity in terms of numbers of population, political or economic clout, and so on. So it's very difficult to look at just the raw numbers of 193 countries and the way that they vote to know what the sort of political opinion is of the world. And also let's remember that the peoples of the world, the peoples that make up each of those 193 countries, are not always represented by democratic leaders. Of course, in France, one would expect that the democratically elected leaders would represent the will of the people. But we know that there are many states under totalitarian regimes, dictatorships, monarchies, where the people are not being represented, and we don't know what their views are on Israel and Gaza. What we do know is that the UN General Assembly is showing the grave frustration that many UN member states have about the impotence of the UN system as a whole when the Security Council is deadlocked. And the way that the Security Council is deadlocked is that if any one of the 5 permanent members, those 5 countries that defeated Nazi Germany in 1945, uses its veto, they do not have to be accountable to any of the rest of the member states. And that in 2023 is simply unacceptable to very many of the countries at the UN. And so the calling of this General Assembly special session is their way of showing their anger, their frustration at that impotence that they all have by not being a permanent member of the Security Council.
OK, and if I was to rephrase that question and focus really on Israel's traditional allies, let's say, rather than smaller countries that we don't know much about. I mean, do you think there we're seeing some sense of, look, we're in the third month of this conflict. The death toll is appalling and shocking by anybody's standards at more than 18,000, according to the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza. Do you think we're seeing a shift in attitudes there?
Well, if we look back to Friday and the UN Security Council resolution and vote, the USA used its veto and the UK abstained, which showed that it's still in support of Israel, but not willing to use its veto. At the same time, France voted for the resolution, as did China and Russia, who have been voting for these resolutions at all times. We could really compare this with how the UN Security Council has behaved around Syria for the last 12 or 13 years, and the ways that sometimes China and Russia will use their veto, sometimes only Russia. But the allies of whether it's Israel or Syria or any other country are not really showing what their views are through their votes at the General Assembly. We saw that in the last vote last month. Really, there were countries from the EU that abstained, and there were other countries from the EU that voted for the resolution. But most of those countries have agreed that they want to see condemnation of Hamas and a call for the release of hostages. And if that were to be put into the resolution, I think there would be more support for it from Israel's traditional allies. Not all of them, certainly not the United States of America, but maybe more of the EU states or some of the states from Latin America.
But those comments by Joe Biden today, we haven't heard anything quite like that up until this point, have we? I mean, that's quite telling about what his opinion is as we enter the third month of this conflict. I mean, I don't think we've heard anything quite that stark from him up until this point, have we?
And I think this is where the sort of speeches that are given by politicians have to be viewed in the context of the military action and military support that they are providing. I think it was yesterday that Joe Biden called himself a Zionist while lighting candles for the Jewish festival of Hanukkah in the White House. And today he's also condemning Israel's actions and asking Israel to make sure that it complies with international humanitarian law. We could look at those comments in light of one another, but really the important thing is to look at what actions the USA is taking in the Security Council and militarily, and the same goes with the UK and other of Israel's allies. Are they still continuing to support them in terms of weapons or sending warships to prevent the Houthis from opening up another front in this war in the Middle East? And I think we can't take any of these things out of context from one another. We have to view them all in the round to really understand what's going on a geopolitical level.
And just lastly, Professor, looking at your credentials as a Professor of Law, Conflict and Global Development, let me draw on that expertise and ask you for your opinion on that allegation being made by the Palestinians, notably Hamas, that Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war. I should add that Israel has called that allegation or that accusation obscene. Legally speaking, do they have a point, the Palestinians?
Legally speaking, sieges are allowed within warfare so long as they are proportionate, this legal term proportionate, and so long as they are aimed at the militants, the combatants, and not at the civilians. We won't know until after the war what evidence we have as to whether or not there was a legitimate or illegitimate siege. Certainly, Israel has shown that it's opened up some of the crossings and that aid trucks are trying to get through. We've seen pictures of Hamas militants hijacking those aid trucks, but we've also seen pictures of lengthy queues of aid trucks and not enough border crossings open to allow them all in. But unless they can prove intent, that the Israeli government was intending to starve a population rather than was intending to take proportionate and legitimate aims to free hostages and to remove Hamas, then it is very difficult to say that legally they could be held accountable for starvation.
OK, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Professor Rosa Freedman at the University of Reading in the UK. Thank you very much indeed.